My name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I am a Nigerian writer, and I'm here in Amsterdam to talk about the stories that Europe tells itself about its colonial history. Most of all, the single thing about Europe that has most interested me in recent years is a speech the French President, Nicolas Sarkozy, delivered in Dakar, Senegal in 2007. It was a famous speech, at least judging by how many people forwarded it to me by email. And I would like to use that speech as a basis to talk today about the stories that Europe likes to tell itself about its colonial history. And I should say that by colonial history, I mean its colonial history in Africa, since, not surprisingly, that is what interests me. It is perhaps a little unfair to focus on that speech, because I am almost certain that Sarkozy is not the most popular politician in Europe, and that many do not agree with his positions. And of course, one must generalize and say Europe, even though Iceland does not have France's colonial history. But let us pretend that these cousins, who do not necessarily like each other, are all beneficiaries of the same colonial history. So let me start with a story about a Nigerian woman who is married to a Belgian and has lived there for many years. She said once that she was shocked that her son, while being taught Belgian history, was taught nothing about Congo. She said, "They teach my son in school that he must help the poor Africans, but they don't teach him about what Belgium did in Congo." Of course, all countries are evasive about the past for which they feel ashamed, but I was struck by what seemed to me not to be just evasiveness, but an erasure of history. If her son does not learn that the modern Congo state began 100 years ago as a personal property of a Belgian king who was desperate to get wealthy from ivory and rubber, if her son does not learn that the hands of Congolese people were chopped off for not producing enough resources to meet the king's greed, if her son does not learn that the Belgian government later ruled Congo with a deliberate emphasis on not producing an educated class, so that Congolese could become clerks and mechanics, but they could not go to university. If her son does not learn that more recently, even though it was the Americans who installed the Mobutu dictatorship, Belgium was a major force behind the scenes propping him up. If this young Belgian boy knows nothing of these incidents, then at some point they will perhaps no longer have happened, because the past, after all, is the past because we collectively acknowledge that it is so. This young Belgian boy will grow up to see Africa only as a place that requires his aid, his help, his charity, with no complications for him. A place that can help him show how compassionate he can be, and most of all, a place whose present has no connection to Europe. It is not that Europe has denied its colonial history. Instead, Europe has developed a way of telling the story of its colonial history that ultimately seeks to erase that history. Sarkozy says, "I have not come to deny mistakes or crimes. Mistakes were made, crimes committed. But no one can ask of the generations of today to expiate this crime perpetrated by past generations. No one can ask of the sons to repent for the mistakes of their fathers." Sarkozy also says, "Colonization is not responsible for all the current difficulties of Africa. It is not responsible for the bloody wars between Africans, for the genocides, for the dictators, the fanaticism, the corruption, the prevarication, the waste, and the pollution." And so this, perhaps a little bluntly put, is central to the story that Europe tells itself about its colonial history. It is a story that basically says, yes, colonialism happened, but. And whatever comes after the but is the focus of the story. The but is crucial. The second part of the story is much more emphasized than the first. What the focus on the but does is this: it absolves. It frees Europe of responsibility, of a significant and traceable connection to the African present, and allows it the glow of charity. And I must add again that I am speaking of a general mainstream, since the far right is completely dismissive of any of this, and the far left is so tied up in knots about imperialism that they dare not have an opinion. And so here I mean the middle ground, the opinion that if people could vote on opinions, would get the highest votes. What if I walked into an average classroom anywhere in Europe and asked the students what comes to mind when I say Africa? In addition to the usual war and poverty and aid, there is no doubt that charity of some sort would come to mind. If I asked those same students if there was some connection to their country and to this Africa, they would probably say no. They may very well gesture to something in the distant past, but which certainly has no real bearing on the present state of things. The past, after all, does not merely tell us what happened yesterday, it also illuminates what happens today. The journalist in Denmark, I remember, told me that an average British or average Belgian or average Dutch could not be held responsible for what happened. And I wondered why it had become about the average Belgian and the average Dutch and the average British. What a strange thing to look at history in this way, as something from which one has to personally absolve oneself. Because of course nobody would suggest that the average Belgian struggling to find a job in Antwerp, for example, was personally responsible for the average Congolese struggling to find a meal in Kinshasa. But to acknowledge that just as the average Belgian can take ownership and pride in cultural institutions from 100 years ago, just as the average French can take ownership of the ideals of the French Revolution, then the average European can surely acknowledge that the political inheritance in Congo today is fundamentally European. A system of foreign domination is illegitimate and violent by its very nature, and it leaves long-reaching legacies behind. And that, it seems to me, is what this kind of balancing out of the subject of European colonialism in Africa seeks to do, to erase a general truth. There is also something simplistic about this idea. Yes, there were massacres, but roads were built. Yes, there was a plunder of natural resources, but railways were built. And somewhere in that balancing out, we forget that most of this infrastructure were in fact designed for the removal of resources in as quick and efficient manner as possible. But this kind of counter-history or balancing out strategies are really about erasing history. And this erasure is necessary if Europe's view of itself as a charity giver is to succeed. To talk about colonialism in its fullness is to risk talking about structures that contribute to poverty in Africa. And so, to avoid talking about structures, the discourse often then suggests that the problems in Africa are somehow atavistic or even genetic. Acknowledging the ways in which we are privileged and the ways in which that privilege complicates our charity is very important. If I constantly give my cousins money with no prospect of their ever earning that money themselves, I sometimes wonder whether at some point it becomes about my own goodness. And in much the same way, I sometimes wonder whether there are people who need Africa to be poor. Not consciously wanting it, of course, but a more metaphysical need, because only if Africa is poor can they then have a chance to demonstrate their own goodness, a goodness that is often unreflective. Finally, I would like to end with a story about Nigerian defensiveness. Now, among Nigerians, complaining about our problems is an art form. Most conversations quickly become a litany of complaints about government corruption, light, water, roads, schools. But if a European were to say the same things exactly, to recite the same litany of complaints, Nigerians become defensive, sometimes angrily so. I have always been curious about this brand of defensiveness, which I myself often exhibit, by the way. It seems to me that we have it because we assume that the complaining Nigerian is aware that Nigeria is not only about its problems, is aware of the human complexity, knows of the intelligence and ingenuity of people, knows how they cry and laugh, knows what motivates them and what they aspire to and what they find meaningful. And we suspect that the European, entrenched in a view of us as needers of charity, does not know these other stories about us. And so we bristle about being defined solely by what we do not have and what we are not. And then our defensiveness emerges. Now, I am sure that there are ways in which this defensiveness can be reduced, and I am sure that there are many Europeans who do want to talk of Europe's colonial past in more detail, who want to speak of it as a whole, who do not want to erase. But I think it is time for those people to be more mainstream. I think it is time for them to represent the stories that Europe tells itself about its colonial past. Thank you.